Come closer, and let the noise of your world fall away. Find a quiet space, a comfortable stillness, and allow your breath to slow. We are going on a journey, not across oceans or into the stars, but into a pocket of time, a small room in the past where the air grew heavy and strange. Imagine, if you will, the gentle hiss of a tallow candle, its flame a single, trembling tear of light in an ocean of darkness. Outside, the wind of a New England winter scours the clapboard walls of a small house, a lonely sound that speaks of isolation and the vast, untamed wilderness pressing in from all sides. The year is 1692. The place is a small, anxious village called Salem. In this room, with the shadows dancing and the cold seeping through the floorboards, a story is about to be whispered. It is a story that will begin as a flicker, a strange word, a convulsive fit, and grow until it consumes the very light it was born from. It is a story of fear. But what if that fear was more than just an emotion? What if it was a living thing, an invisible contagion that could pass from one mind to another, rewriting the world in its own dark image? What if a shared nightmare could become so powerful, so utterly convincing, that it could reach out from the realm of thought and lead real bodies to a real gallows? This is not just a tale of superstition or a relic of a bygone era. It is a deep and quiet exploration of the human mind under pressure, a look into the architecture of panic itself. It is a reminder that the line between the world we see and the world we believe in is drawn not in stone, but in breath and shadow and whispers. We are often told that history is a collection of facts, dates, and names, a solid thing we can stand upon. But sometimes, history is more like a fog. It is a story of atmosphere, of a collective feeling that settled over a people like a winter frost, chilling them to the bone and changing the shape of everything they saw. To understand what happened in Salem, we must do more than simply look at the events. We must try to feel the air, to hear the silence between the floorboards, to understand the deep, resonant dread that lived in the hearts of people who believed, with every fiber of their being, that the devil was not a distant concept, but a neighbor, a presence that could be standing just outside their door, waiting for an invitation. So let us be still, and let us listen. Let us travel back to that cold, candlelit room and watch as a spark is struck in the dark, and wonder, with a quiet and open curiosity, how such a small light could cast such a long and devastating shadow across the snow. Before the first whisper of witchcraft, there was the quiet hum of ordinary life, a life threaded with hardship and a profound, unyielding faith. Picture the world as it was for the people of Salem village. It was not a world of gentle landscapes and sprawling towns, but a small, fragile foothold on the edge of an immense and unknown continent. The forest was not a place of recreation, it was a deep, dark, and menacing presence, believed to be the domain of the devil himself, a place where native tribes, seen through a lens of fear and suspicion, moved like shadows. Life was a constant negotiation with the elements. The winters were brutal, long stretches of white silence that buried the world and tested the limits of survival. The summers were a feverish race to cultivate the rocky soil, to store enough food to withstand the coming cold. Death was not a distant abstraction, it was a constant companion. It came in the form of disease, of childbirth, of accident, of conflict. Every family had felt its touch, had dug the hard earth to bury a child, a spouse, a parent. Their world was governed by a rigid and demanding theology. For these Puritans, life was not a journey of self-discovery, but a test, a spiritual battlefield where the forces of God and Satan waged a constant war for the souls of humankind. Every event, no matter how small, was a sign, a message from the divine or a temptation from the demonic. A failed crop was not just bad luck, it was a sign of God's displeasure. A sudden illness was not just a biological event, it could be a diabolical assault. There was no room for ambiguity, no space for chance. Everything had a meaning, a place in the grand, invisible struggle. This worldview, while providing a sense of order and purpose, also created a profound and pervasive anxiety. If God was all-powerful, then so too was his adversary. The devil was real as the wooden pews in their unheated meeting house, as real as the icy wind that rattled their window panes. He was an active agent in the world, a tempter, a deceiver, a predator who sought to break their covenant with God and drag their souls into eternal damnation. They saw his handiwork everywhere, in the vanity of a young woman, in the greed of a merchant, in the anger between neighbors. This constant, low-level fear was the soil in which the seeds of the witch trials would be planted. It was a community already primed for a crisis of faith, already looking for an external enemy to explain its internal fractures. The village itself was deeply divided. Disputes over land, over the choice of a minister, over property lines and social status had festered for years, creating a web of resentment and suspicion that lay just beneath the surface of their pious society. They were a people living under immense pressure, both from the outside world and from within their own hearts, striving for a state of spiritual purity that was impossibly high, and terrified of the damnation that awaited them if they failed. It is into this cold, anxious, and deeply religious world that we must step. We must understand that for them, witchcraft was not a fantasy. It was a genuine and terrifying crime, a pact with the ultimate evil, a betrayal not just of the community, but of God himself. The fear was not irrational, it was the logical conclusion of their entire belief system. And in the winter of 1692, in the small, stuffy kitchen of the village minister, that fear would finally be given a name, a face, and a voice. It began in the home of the Reverend Samuel Parris, a man whose rigid piety and contentious nature had already deepened the rifts within the village. In the heart of his house, in the small circle of warmth offered by the kitchen hearth, a group of young women gathered. Among them were his 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams. In a world that demanded of them a quiet, submissive, and industrious piety, a world with little room for the whimsy or rebellion of youth, these girls found a small, secret space for themselves. Here, with Paris's enslaved servant, Tituba, they engaged in a forbidden act of fortune-telling, dropping an egg white into a glass of water, trying to divine the trade of their future husbands. It was a simple act of girlish curiosity, a flirtation with the unknown in a world that demanded absolute certainty. But in that murky water, one of the girls saw a shape she interpreted as a coffin. And with that vision, a door was opened. A playful game turned into a terrifying omen. Soon after, the strange behavior began. Betty Paris would fall silent for long periods, then burst into fits of screaming. She would crawl under furniture, contort her body into unnatural positions, and complain of being pinched and bitten by invisible forces. Abigail Williams soon followed suit, and then other girls in the village began to exhibit the same terrifying symptoms, and Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Elizabeth Hubbard. They were seized by convulsions, their bodies arching and twisting as if in agony. They would bark like dogs or flutter their arms as if trying to fly. They were, in the language of the time, afflicted. We can only imagine the terror that gripped the Paris household, and then the village. What was this strange malady? The local doctor, William Griggs, was called. He examined the girls, and finding no physical cause for their ailments, he offered the only diagnosis his 17th-century worldview could provide: they were bewitched. The word hung in the air, heavy and dark. Bewitched. It was the confirmation of their deepest fears. The devil had breached their defenses. He was no longer a distant threat in the dark woods, he was here, in their homes, tormenting their children. The diagnosis was not a cause of the panic, but rather a match thrown onto a pile of tinder that had been accumulating for decades. The village's anxieties, its religious fervor, its social strife, its fear of the wilderness, its recent traumas from brutal frontier wars, all found a focal point in the writhing bodies of these young girls. They became a spectacle, a living testament to the spiritual war raging in their midst. The afflicted girls, once powerless and on the lowest rung of the social ladder, were suddenly at the center of a terrifying and important drama. Their words, their cries, their accusations, held the attention of the entire community. Their pain was seen as a holy suffering, a battle being fought on behalf of all the faithful. The adults, desperate for an explanation, for a way to fight back against this invisible enemy, turned to the girls and asked the question that would set the tragedy in motion: who is it that afflicts you? In that question, the power shifted. The search for a witch had begun. And the girls, caught in a storm of attention, fear, and religious fervor, would soon provide the answers the community was so desperate to hear. The pressure mounted on the afflicted girls. Day after day, ministers, magistrates, and concerned neighbors gathered around them, praying, questioning, demanding to know the source of their torment. Who hurts you? The question was a relentless drumbeat. At first, the girls were silent, or perhaps they did not know. But in a world where every ailment had a supernatural cause, a nameless affliction was an unbearable vacuum. An enemy had to be identified. An agent of the devil had to be found. And so, the first names were spoken. They were not the names of powerful or respected members of the community. They were the names of the marginal, the different, the people who already existed on the fringes of Salem's tightly knit society. The first was Tituba, the Paris's enslaved servant from the Caribbean. Her cultural differences, her otherness, made her an easy target. She was a woman without power, without allies, whose stories and folk magic, perhaps shared in the innocence of the kitchen, were now reinterpreted through a lens of diabolical suspicion. The second was Sarah Good, a homeless woman who survived by begging and was known for her sullen temper and muttering under her breath when she was turned away. She was a nuisance, a social problem, a woman who did not fit the Puritan ideal of a demure and productive wife. The third was Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who had been embroiled in disputes over her late husband's estate and had not attended church in over a year. She was reclusive, contentious, and had violated social norms by attempting to control her own property. These three women represented the perfect initial scapegoats, a woman of a different race and culture, a destitute and disliked beggar, and a socially deviant outcast. They were the path of least resistance. Their accusations would not challenge the established social order, they would reinforce it. On the 1st of March, 1692, the examinations began. This was not a trial in any modern sense. It was a public inquest held in the village meeting house, a space that was both the civic and religious heart of the community. The room was packed, the air thick with fear and anticipation. The magistrates, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, sat as the authorities, but the true spectacle was the confrontation between the accused and their accusers. The afflicted girls were present, and their bodies became the primary evidence. As Sarah Good was brought forward, the girls began to writhe and scream, claiming her specter, her invisible spirit shape, was tormenting them right there in the meeting house. What evil spirit have you familiarity with? Hathorne demanded. I am innocent, she insisted, but her denials were futile. Every time she looked at the girls, they would fall into fits. Her desperate pleas were seen not as proof of innocence, but as the cunning lies of a witch. The logic of the proceedings was circular and impossible to escape. If you denied the charges, your very composure was proof of your cold-hearted alliance with the devil. If you showed anger or distress, it was proof of your guilt. The girls were the arbiters of truth, their convulsions and cries the undeniable evidence of a spectral assault. Then came Tituba. Pressured, likely beaten by Reverend Paris, and trapped in a terrifying situation in a foreign land, she did something the other two had not. She confessed. And she did not just confess, she elaborated. She spun a vivid and terrifying tale that confirmed every fear the Puritans held. She spoke of signing the devil's book in blood. She described a coven of witches, a black dog, a red cat, and a tall, dark man from Boston who was their leader. She claimed that Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were her confederates, and chillingly, that there were other, unnamed witches in Salem village who sought to destroy the community. Tituba's confession was a cataclysm. It was the moment the abstract fear of witchcraft became a concrete reality. It was no longer a matter of one or two malevolent individuals, it was a conspiracy, a hidden army of Satan's followers living amongst them. Her story provided a narrative, a framework for the chaos. It validated the girls' afflictions, it confirmed the magistrate's suspicions, and it gave the terrified community a clear and present enemy to fight. The panic, which had been a smoldering ember, now burst into a raging fire. The hunt was no longer for a few outcasts, it was for the entire coven. And with Tituba's confession echoing in their ears, the people of Salem turned to look at their neighbors, their friends, their family, and began to wonder, who else has signed the devil's book? The concept of spectral evidence became the engine of the trials, a mechanism as powerful as it was insubstantial. It was the belief that a witch could send their spirit, or specter, out from their physical body to torment their victims. This specter was invisible to all but the afflicted. It was a ghost of an idea, a phantom accusation given the weight of a physical assault. In the Salem courtroom, the very fabric of justice was inverted. The accuser's testimony, based on these invisible, spectral attacks, was treated as irrefutable fact, while the accused's denial was dismissed as a lie. The burden of proof was placed not on the accuser to demonstrate guilt, but on the accused to prove their innocence against an invisible crime, a task that was, by its very nature, impossible. Imagine yourself standing in that crowded meeting house, accused. The air is cold and stale, thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and the palpable hum of collective fear. You stand before the magistrates, your neighbors, the people you have known your entire life, their faces a mixture of terror, piety, and morbid curiosity. And then, as you begin to speak, to profess your innocence, one of the afflicted girls cries out. She points a trembling finger at you and shrieks that your specter is pinching her neck, that your invisible form is sitting on the meetinghouse beam, laughing. Other girls fall to the floor, their bodies convulsing, their limbs flailing. They cry out your name, begging you to stop your spectral torment. What can you do? How do you defend yourself against an attack that no one else can see? Every gesture you make is mirrored and misinterpreted. If you bite your lip in anxiety, a girl will scream that you are biting her. If you wring your hands in despair, another will cry that you are twisting her own hands with your spectral power. You are trapped in a theater of the absurd, a living nightmare where your own body, your own words, are used as weapons against you. The magistrates, men of standing and education, are utterly convinced by this spectacle. They lean forward, their questions laced with the certainty of your guilt. Why do you hurt these children? They ask, not, did you hurt them? The presumption of guilt is absolute. The trial is not a process of discovery, it is a ritual of confirmation. Your life, your reputation, your very soul, hangs in the balance, dependent on the spectral visions of a group of traumatized and empowered young women. This reliance on spectral evidence created a terrifyingly effective feedback loop. An accusation was made, the girls would perform the torment, and this performance would be taken as proof of the accusation's validity, which in turn encouraged more accusations. The system fed on itself, growing larger and more insatiable with each examination. It was a mass delusion codified into law. For the people of Salem, this was not a perversion of justice, it was a necessary tool in a holy war. How else could one fight an enemy who dealt in spirits and shadows? To them, the spectral world was as real as the physical one. They believed they were seeing the invisible battle made manifest in the tortured bodies of their children. But in their desperate attempt to make the invisible visible, they created a legal framework where accusation was conviction, and the only escape was to confess and, in turn, become an accuser yourself, pointing the finger at someone else to save your own skin. And so, the net widened, pulling in more and more people, as the phantom evidence of specters piled up, each invisible blow, each unseen pinch, adding another stone to the growing pyre of their community's reason. The first person to be brought to trial and face the ultimate consequence of this spectral justice was a woman named Bridget Bishop. She was not a stranger to accusation. Known for her colorful clothing, particularly a red bodice that stood out in the sea of Puritan gray, her ownership of a tavern where drinking and games were permitted, and her sharp tongue, she had been a subject of gossip and suspicion for years. She was an outsider not by birth, but by temperament. She did not conform. She was outspoken, independent, and had been accused of witchcraft once before, though she was acquitted. This history made her a vulnerable target, a name that could be easily attached to the growing conspiracy. When she was brought for examination, the scene was one of dramatic, almost theatrical, chaos. The afflicted girls claimed that her very presence was a torment. They said her specter was attacking them, that she was the orchestrator of their pain. One of the most damning pieces of spectral evidence against her came when she simply looked up at the rafters of the meeting house. At that exact moment, a piece of board fell from the ceiling, causing a great commotion. To the terrified onlookers, this was no coincidence. It was a clear demonstration of her malevolent power, her ability to command the physical world with a mere glance. Her fate was all but sealed in that moment of manufactured meaning. The tangible evidence brought against her was just as tenuous, a collection of local folklore and neighborly grudges given a sinister new interpretation. Men from the village testified that she had bewitched their livestock. Others claimed her specter had visited them in the night, sitting on their chests and leaving them breathless. The most peculiar evidence involved the discovery of poppets, small dolls made of rags with pins stuck in them, in the wall of her former home. In the Puritan mind, this was the undeniable paraphernalia of a witch, tools for sympathetic magic used to curse and harm her neighbors. Bridget Bishop maintained her innocence with a strength that, to her accusers, seemed only to confirm her guilt. When asked by the magistrates if she was a witch, she replied with a clarity that has echoed through the centuries, "I am no witch. I am innocent. I know nothing of it." Her steadfast denial was seen as the brazen audacity of a hardened servant of Satan. There was no room in their minds for the possibility that she was simply an innocent woman caught in a web of lies and delusion. The court, newly formed by Governor William Phips, was a special court of oyer and terminer, a court to hear and determine. It was created specifically to deal with the overwhelming number of witchcraft accusations. Lacking legal precedent and guided by a profound theological certainty, the judges, including the notoriously zealous William Stoughton, accepted spectral evidence as a primary basis for conviction. On June 2, 1692, Bridget Bishop was found guilty of witchcraft and sentenced to death. 8 days later, on June 10, she was taken to a barren rise of land outside the village, a place that would come to be known as Gallows Hill. We can only imagine her final moments, the cart rattling along the dirt road, the faces of her neighbors, once familiar, now twisted by fear and certainty. She was the first to hang. Her death was a pivotal moment. It was the point of no return. It demonstrated to the community that the authorities were not just investigating, but were willing to execute people based on these accusations. It validated the entire process, lending the weight of official, state-sanctioned violence to the girl's spectral visions. Bridget Bishop's death did not quell the hysteria, it emboldened it. It proved that the system worked, that the enemy could be identified, tried, and eliminated. Her execution was a signal that the war was real, the stakes were life and death, and the hunt would continue until every last hidden agent of the devil was brought out into the light and destroyed. The silence that followed her death on Gallows Hill was not the silence of peace, but the quiet, terrified intake of breath before the storm truly broke. As the summer of 1692 wore on, the accusations began to climb the social ladder, moving from the marginalized and disliked to the respected and pious. No one demonstrated this terrifying shift more clearly than Rebecca Nurse. She was a 71-year-old woman, a mother and grandmother, widely regarded in the community as a model of Christian piety. She was gentle, devout, and by all accounts, a woman of unimpeachable character. When her name was first uttered by the afflicted girls, it was met with a rare moment of public disbelief. Rebecca Nurse? It seemed impossible. She was the very embodiment of the Puritan ideal. Surely, the devil could not have taken hold of a soul so virtuous. A petition was circulated on her behalf, signed by dozens of her neighbors, attesting to her good character and blameless life. It was a brave act in a climate of such intense fear, a testament to the deep respect the community held for her. But the machinery of the trials, once set in motion, was nearly impossible to stop. The belief system that drove the panic had its own dark logic. If the devil was trying to destroy their city on a hill, their holy community, who would be a more valuable prize, a more devastating agent of chaos, than one of the most devout among them? The accusation against Rebecca Nurse, therefore, was not seen as a mistake, but as proof of the devil's cunning and audacity. Her examination was a heart-wrenching spectacle. Frail and hard of hearing, she faced her accusers with a quiet dignity that stood in stark contrast to their frantic convulsions. When she saw the girls writhing on the floor, she did not react with anger, but with a kind of bewildered compassion. "I have got nobody to look to but God," she said, her voice steady. Her calm demeanor, her logical and patient answers, seemed to confound the magistrates. The jury, too, was moved. After deliberating, they returned with a verdict of not guilty. For a brief moment, it seemed that reason might prevail, that the testimony of a good life could stand against the spectral visions of the afflicted. But the moment was fleeting. Upon hearing the verdict, the afflicted girls in the courtroom erupted in a fresh wave of violent fits and shrieks. The crowd murmured in outrage. The chief magistrate, William Stoughton, openly expressed his dissatisfaction, sending the jury back to reconsider their verdict. He pointed to a single ambiguous phrase she had uttered during the trial. When a confessed witch was brought in as a witness against her, Rebecca had said, "What, do you bring her? She is one of us." She likely meant that the confessor was, like her, a fellow prisoner, a fellow accused. But in the paranoid atmosphere of the courtroom, her words were twisted to mean, "She is one of us witches." Under immense pressure from the court and the public, the jury reversed its decision. The verdict was now guilty. Rebecca Nurse, the pious grandmother, the respected church member, was condemned to hang. Even then, the governor, William Phips, seemed to have his doubts and issued a reprieve. But the outcry from the magistrates and the public was so fierce that he rescinded it. On July 19, 1692, Rebecca Nurse was taken to Gallows Hill along with 4 other women. Her execution sent a chilling message to the people of Massachusetts Bay: no one was safe. If a woman as revered as Rebecca Nurse could be a witch, then anyone could. Piety, good character, a lifetime of virtuous living, none of these were a defense. The foundation of their social world was cracking. The very people who were supposed to be the pillars of the community were now being cast as its secret destroyers. The execution of Rebecca Nurse marked the death of doubt. For many, it silenced the quiet, nagging voice of reason that might have questioned the proceedings. To speak out in defense of the accused was now to risk accusation yourself. It was safer to remain silent, to nod along, to accept the unacceptable. The hysteria had reached a point where it was no longer just about identifying witches, it was about survival, about demonstrating one's own piety and loyalty by participating in the purge, lest the accusing finger turn next in your direction. The quiet dignity of Rebecca Nurse on the gallows stood as a silent rebuke to the madness, a testament to a faith that held true even when the world built around it had descended into a nightmare of its own making. By late summer and early autumn, the panic had reached its zenith. The small jail in Salem was overflowing, and prisoners were being held in neighboring towns like Ipswich and Boston. The conditions were deplorable. The accused were packed into dark, filthy cells, often bound in chains, which were believed to help contain their spectral powers. They were charged for their own imprisonment, for the food they ate, for the very shackles that bound them. Many were forced to sell their property to pay these fees, their families left destitute. The trials continued with a grim, mechanical efficiency. The court at Salem had become a factory of condemnation. Accusations were now flying with reckless abandon, settling old scores and reflecting the deep-seated social anxieties of the community. The afflicted girls, now a celebrated and feared group, had become practiced in their performances. Their influence was immense. They could, with a word or a writhe, condemn anyone to the gallows. Some historians and psychologists speculate on what was truly happening with these girls. Was it outright fraud, a conscious deception that spun out of control? Was it a form of conversion disorder, a psychological condition where intense emotional stress manifests as physical symptoms? Or was it something in between, a state of self-delusion where they genuinely believed in the reality of their own spectral visions, caught in a powerful feedback loop of communal reinforcement? Perhaps it was a mixture of all three, a complex psychological event that we can only partially understand from our modern vantage point. What is certain is that they were not the only drivers of the hysteria. They were the catalysts, but the true fuel was the collective belief of the adults around them, the ministers who preached of a diabolical conspiracy, the magistrates who validated spectral evidence, and the ordinary citizens who packed the meeting house, eager to see the devil's agents exposed. The accusations grew more and more outlandish. The Reverend George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem Village, was accused of being the ringleader of the witches, the dark man from Boston that Tituba had spoken of. He was a man of impressive physical strength, and tales were told of him lifting a heavy musket with a single finger, a feat now reinterpreted as a sign of demonic power. During his execution, he stood on the ladder before the crowd and recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, something a witch was believed to be incapable of doing. The crowd wavered, a murmur of doubt rippling through them. It was a critical moment. But from the crowd, the influential minister Cotton Mather, sitting on his horse, assured the people that the devil could appear as an angel of light. He reminded them of Burroughs's guilt, and the execution proceeded. The hanging of a Harvard-educated minister was a profound escalation, proof that the hunt would spare no one, regardless of status or education. Another victim, Giles Corey, an 81-year-old farmer, provides one of the most harrowing stories of the trials. Knowing the court would convict him and that his property would then be forfeit, leaving his family with nothing, he refused to enter a plea of either guilty or not guilty. He would not participate in the charade. The penalty for refusing to plead was an archaic and brutal form of torture, peine forte et dure, or pressing. He was laid on the ground, a wooden board placed on his chest, and heavy stones were piled on top, one by one, to force him to enter a plea. For 2 days, he endured the agony in silence, his only reported words being a defiant cry for more weight. He was pressed to death, a martyr to the preservation of his family's property and a silent, final protest against the madness of the court. His death, so gruesome and so public, was a stark illustration of the terrifying lengths the authorities would go to in order to maintain the logic of their proceedings. By the end of September, 19 men and women had been hanged on Gallows Hill. Giles Corey had been pressed to death. Several others had died in prison. The community was bleeding, tearing itself apart from the inside, all in the name of purification. As the leaves began to turn and the air grew crisp with the promise of another winter, the first significant cracks in the foundation of the hysteria began to appear. The fire had burned too hot, for too long, and consumed too much. The sheer number of accusations had begun to strain credulity. Over 200 people were now in jail, and the accusations were no longer confined to Salem. They had spread to neighboring towns like Andover, where a single complaint could lead to the arrest of dozens. The accusers, emboldened by their power, grew reckless. They began to name people whose reputations for piety and good standing were so absolute that the accusations simply could not stick. They accused the wife of the Reverend John Hale of Beverly, a man who had been a supporter of the trials up to that point. Faced with the accusation of his own beloved wife, he began to have profound second thoughts. Most significantly, it is said they accused Lady Mary Phipps, the wife of the governor himself. Whether this specific accusation is legend or fact, it is clear that the crisis had reached the highest levels of power in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The elite of Boston, who had initially supported the trials, were growing increasingly uneasy. A group of influential ministers, led by Increase Mather, the father of Cotton Mather, began to publicly question the court's methods. Increase Mather was a powerful figure, the president of Harvard College. He did not question the existence of witches, but he powerfully condemned the reliance on spectral evidence. In a sermon published under the title, Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits, he argued that it was better that 10 suspected witches escape than that one innocent person be condemned. He wrote that the devil could, in fact, assume the shape of an innocent person to trick the court. This was a devastating blow to the logic of the trials. If the devil could impersonate an innocent person, then the core evidence upon which every conviction had been based, the spectral testimony of the afflicted girls, was rendered utterly worthless. It meant the court could no longer distinguish between a witch and an innocent person. Governor Phipps, perhaps spurred by the accusations against his own wife and certainly influenced by the shifting opinions of the Boston clergy, finally took decisive action. In October 1692, he ordered a halt to the proceedings of the court of Oyer and Terminer. He forbade further arrests and disbanded the court that had condemned so many. A new superior court was established to handle the remaining cases, but with a crucial new rule: spectral evidence was no longer admissible. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Without the phantom testimony of the afflicted, the prosecution's cases collapsed. Of the dozens of people tried by the new court, only 3 were convicted, and Governor Phipps swiftly pardoned them, along with everyone else still held in prison on witchcraft charges. The machine had been stopped. The great and terrible hunt was over. But the unwinding of the hysteria was not a sudden moment of collective clarity. It was a slow, painful, and shame-filled dawn. There was no single event that broke the spell, but rather a gradual erosion of belief, a slow accumulation of doubt. The fever did not break with a cheer, but with a quiet, exhausted sigh. The afflicted girls, once the center of a great cosmic drama, slowly fell silent, their power vanished. The community, which had been so united in its righteous fury, was left to survey the wreckage. The gallows on the hill stood empty. The jails were opened. And the people of Salem were left with the silence, the empty chairs at their tables, and the terrible, dawning realization of what they had done to themselves. The devil had not come to Salem in the form of witches with black books and spectral familiars. The evil that had visited them was a far more human one, born of their own fear, their own certainty, and their own willingness to believe the worst of their neighbors. In the years that followed the trials, a profound and heavy silence settled over Salem. It was the silence of shame, of grief, and of a community trying to reckon with a wound it had inflicted upon itself. The names of the 19 who were hanged and the others who died were rarely spoken aloud. The events of 1692 became a source of deep communal trauma, a memory too painful to confront directly. But slowly, tentatively, the process of reconciliation and repentance began. It was not a swift or easy process. It came in quiet, individual acts of conscience and later, informal, public apologies. In 1697, 5 years after the trials, the General Court of Massachusetts ordered a day of fasting and prayer for the tragedy that had occurred. On that day, one of the judges, Samuel Sewall, stood before his congregation in Boston while his minister read his public confession aloud. Sewall, a man who had been a key figure in the condemnations, stood with his head bowed, accepting the blame and shame of the innocent blood that had been shed and praying for God's forgiveness. He was the only one of the judges to ever make such a public apology. It was a remarkable act of humility and courage, a man of immense public standing admitting to a catastrophic failure of judgment. In 1706, Ann Putnam Jr., who had been one of the most prolific and powerful of the afflicted girls, stood before the Salem village church. She was now a young woman, her life marked by illness and isolation. Her own parents had died shortly after the trials, and she had been left to raise her younger siblings. In a quiet voice, she offered her own confession. She spoke of being deluded by Satan, of being the instrument of the suffering and death of innocent people. She singled out Rebecca Nurse by name, asking for forgiveness from the families of those she had wronged. Her apology, like Sewall's, offers a poignant glimpse into the psychological aftermath. Was she confessing to a deliberate lie, or to a delusion she now saw with clearer eyes? We will never know for certain, but her words speak of a heavy burden carried for more than a decade. The government of Massachusetts also took steps to make amends. In 1711, a bill was passed that formally reversed the attainder, the legal consequences of a conviction, for many of the accused, restoring their good names. Financial compensation was offered to the survivors and the families of the victims, a small, inadequate sum meant to acknowledge the immense material and emotional damage that had been done. But for some, the apologies and the money came too late, or not at all. The social fabric of Salem and the surrounding communities had been torn to shreds. Families were broken, reputations destroyed, and the bonds of trust between neighbors were shattered. The land itself seemed to hold the memory. The fields of the executed were left untended, their houses abandoned. Gallows Hill became a place to be avoided, a haunted landscape on the edge of town. The story of Salem did not end in 1692. It echoed down through the generations, becoming a dark folklore, a cautionary tale whispered to children. It became a foundational story for a new nation that was grappling with ideas of justice, religious freedom, and the dangers of unchecked authority. The trials became a symbol, a powerful metaphor for any time a society, gripped by fear, turns on a perceived enemy within its own ranks. The long silence of Salem was not just an absence of noise. It was the sound of a community grappling with the ghost of its own certainty, the haunting knowledge that the monsters they had hunted were, in the end, reflections of themselves. They had looked into the darkness for the devil, and had seen their own faces staring back. And so we return from that cold, distant room, back to the quiet and the stillness of this present moment. We leave behind the scent of wood smoke and the weight of a fear that feels, at once, both ancient and unsettlingly familiar. The story of Salem is not merely a historical curiosity, a relic of a superstitious past we have long since outgrown. It is a mirror. It is a timeless and deeply human story about what can happen when fear is allowed to become the primary lens through which we see the world. The events of 1692 were not, in the end, about witches. They were about a perfect storm of circumstances, a rigid and fearful worldview, social and economic anxieties, a legal system that accepted the unbelievable as fact, and the simple, terrifying power of group psychology. It was a story about the human need for certainty in an uncertain world. In the face of disease, hardship, and the unknown, the people of Salem found a simple, terrible explanation for their troubles. The idea of a diabolical conspiracy, as frightening as it was perhaps less frightening than the alternative, that the world was chaotic, random, and that suffering could be meaningless. The witch hunt provided a narrative, a sense of control. It gave them an enemy to fight, a ritual to perform, a way to purge the evil they felt was destroying them. It was a desperate attempt to impose order on a world that felt like it was spinning apart. And in our own time, are we so different? We may no longer believe in spectral evidence or the devil's book, but the architecture of panic remains the same. We still live in a world filled with anxieties, political, social, economic, existential. We are still bombarded with information and misinformation, still struggling to tell the difference between what is real and what is a phantom. And we are still susceptible to the same psychological traps. We are still prone to tribalism, to dividing the world into a simple, us versus them. We are still quick to find scapegoats, to blame a specific group for complex problems. We still feel the pull of confirmation bias, the desire to seek out information that confirms what we already believe and to dismiss anything that challenges it. The technologies have changed, but the human mind has not. The Salem Meeting House has been replaced by the infinite echo chamber of the Internet, where whispers can become roars in an instant, where accusations can circle the globe in seconds, and where public shame can be delivered with the click of a button. The story of Salem is a profound and gentle reminder of the importance of doubt, of humility, of the courage it takes to question our own certainty. It reminds us that justice requires not passion, but patience, not conviction, but evidence. It teaches us about the fragility of reason and the immense danger of a closed belief system, a world where dissent is seen as heresy and questioning is seen as betrayal. It calls on us to look at the witches of our own time, the people we demonize, the groups we fear, and to ask whether we are seeing a true evil, or simply a reflection of our own anxieties. The final, quiet lesson of Salem is one of empathy. It is an invitation to look back at every person caught in that tragedy, the accusers and the accused, the judges and the ministers, the silent and the outspoken, and to see not monsters or fools, but human beings. Human beings who were doing what they thought was right, trapped in a story that was larger than any one of them. By understanding their humanity, we can better understand our own. We can recognize our own capacity for fear and for certainty, and we can choose, instead, the more difficult, more courageous path of compassion, of critical thought, and of grace. And so, as our journey ends, let the story settle. Let it be not a source of fear, but a source of quiet wisdom. Let it be a reminder to hold our beliefs lightly, to listen deeply, and to always leave room for the possibility that we might be wrong. Let the candle flame of that long-ago winter be a gentle light that illuminates our own path forward. And now, in the quiet that follows, may you find a sense of peace, a sense of understanding, and a gentle rest.